Hi, everybody. How's it going, Fred?
It's going good, Harry. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here with you.
I'm really glad to
So
be.
happy that your book is out, and congratulations on it.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, I'm just, super excited that you could, make time to talk to me today because you have always, been completely inspiring to me, and and yourself and your reading you and thinking with you, all of those things has really helped me address and think through and with and into all kinds of things that have been bugging me that I've been struggling with for a long time. So I was really glad to, discover you and your brain. So thank you for being here. I'm gonna read a little bit, everybody, from the book, just about 2 minutes, and then we'll kind of launch into things. And first, I have this kind of notes that I wrote down. So pardon me while I look at this paper for a second. So, because like I get a little nervous and I don't want to forget anything, but I do want to thank not just Fred, but also Maris Kreitzman and McNally Jackson for hosting this event. Look for the donation link in the chat. These events don't put themselves on, and also Maris is going to put book links in the chat as well. I also want to thank Penguin Press, especially my editor there, Chris Richards, for supporting the project. It's a kind of a weird project, so I was very fortunate. And also thanks to PJ Mark, who's been key in shepherding this book out into the public sphere. And thanks to my family, Iggy, Lenny, my kids, and Maggie, who think with me and hang out with me and inspire me every day, and to all the thinkers and artists and readers mentioned and unmentioned in the book. Connecting with you, trying to figure stuff out has been a pleasure, and my art and thought is indebted to you. Really excited to be here with you, Fred. Congratulations, you're a MacArthur Fellow now. I'm hoping that there's something about that feels good, that recognition and support. So I'm happy you could all join me for this crazy belated book party. So I'm going to start by reading through a couple short sections that Fred and I picked out yesterday, but I'm going to set the scene a little bit, okay? In the book, there's like a few questions that are fundamental, I feel anyway. I'm trying to make sense of how much I love matterphilia, and that generates all kinds of thought streams about consciousness, about thinking, about AI, the atomic storm, like if there are these natural laws, stuff particles like to do, then where does chance originate? The random, which I sort of think of as ontological preoccupations. And the book's also about how to be in relation to unknowability, a question that in the book branches into poetics and language, and whether the body thinks and whether it thinks in figures. So more epistemological stuff, and a lot related to expression, poetics, and art. But it seems that one of the most fundamental queries in the book is about interconnectedness. The fact that to me, a very sort of concrete material way, we're constantly being formed and unformed by everything else. And I mean interstellar energy flows to the tiniest of particles. I think about this unbroken, continuous, universal field that we're all part of and inside of, so entangled and webbed up. And that generates, for me, a lot of questions about connecting on a human scale. How is it that we find one another, show up, bond? And, in the book, in light of this absolute connectedness and impressionability, which I really buy, also, how does separateness work? How does loneliness work? So I'm sort of teasing around all this stuff, and that gets trotted out sometimes directly, but also through the energy of juxtaposition and specific stories borrowed from my life. The character of the author, I like to say the character of the author, who's sort of me and really not me, is desperately orbiting around these things that are unresolvable. So that's my little intro, in case you haven't read yet. And now I'll read these two little excerpts. One's on page 52 and one is on page 148. So here's from page 52. I don't believe I'm my own best front, terminal, tie-in, interface, my body, my social bones, what's on offer there. Rather, I want my art these objects, this language, to be my social body. I believe the art is a better nexus, joint to the best parts of me, a realer me. I want to stay home and work, let art do all my talking. Not unrelated, I always think if I put everything into the work to the exclusion of all else, the objects that erupt, pullulate by this practice, distillation, would accordingly be steeped with an ardor such that they would travel out into the world and provide people all the love and company and attention I've there invested. That making alone would somehow be fully satisfying, qualify as social, and that the exhibition as some utterly authentic virtual rendezvous would somehow serve as a thorough modus of loving. In this way, practice alone would assuage loneliness and destructive experiences of isolation. It's a wager I've been nursing for decades. None of this ever seems to work in the way I have planned. So there's that little section, and then one more little section like that from page 148. February 2017. I take much pleasure in being alone, but there's also a strange warm grace in not being alone, Charles Bukowski wrote. Although one can never be precisely alone, so much about this observation seems useful. Hannah Arendt wrote about tables, that although they appeared to be a kind of motor for separation, they might also be considered to be connectional, a type of interstitial tissue through which sociality flows. Could it be that the space between people works similarly, a motley functionality? Maybe this pith, the pith of relation that I've written about, the very diffuse meat between people, the very diffuse meat between people and things sometimes fails to conduct. Perhaps it occasionally acts as a kind of mute, as in a trumpet, a deadener or baffle. Maybe this is why an object imbued with my attention won't then disperse that sum as in the distributive property in math. Perhaps I've misdiagnosed this at any rate. Additionally, encounters with kith and kin where amity is born by a spontaneous, non-conscious passion are qualitatively distinct from encounters that are forged through and in spite of difference. The latter, which entertains perceived risk, produces a kind of intensity or dissonance, or one and then the other. So the point is not flesh or encounter in general, but really the charge of novelty, what it does to duration, or unpredictability, that peril, the way it folds event time up like a taffy machine, makes it dense, and then voltaic or persuasive. And sometimes I'm prepared for that, you see, and sometimes I'm not. So that's those two sections, and I'll just take a break from talking for a second because I know Fred had something to say about that, especially that second section.
Man, I had a really good class. We had a good class Tuesday morning, and something kind of great happened where I have a friend who's a former student at at a college in Maryland, and they've been zooming into our class at NYU. And I guess like so many people, um, maybe in the humanities over the last 10 or 15 years, and I know like you too, Harry, I just I've been so obsessed with physics and trying to understand it, in some sort of non-mathematical or pseudo-mathematical way.
Yeah.
And this friend of mine is a chemist, and at a certain point, she just stopped us. She was like, "What do you think you're doing? What do you think you're doing?" As if you could talk about this without the math.
Yeah.
And we kind of we resisted. We were like, "No, we can do what we want." But there's this part of what you're saying that makes me realize how fanciful I've always been about the physics part of it and about the way I want to think about entanglement. And that's the key terms. Like I want to think about it a certain kind of way,
Yeah.
which means like I don't want to think about it another way. And
Exactly.
one of the beautiful things about my Meteorite, and it's in both of those passages that you just read, is something you said even introducing them, is that you're interested also in seeing how separateness works. Um, and I guess I want to if you're rested enough, I want to hear you talk some about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I even wrote to you along, some like grotesque rudimentary history about my thought process with uh, my thought process with an idea about category. Actually, is sort of where it started, and I've been sort of like so many of us, sort of tortured by certain categories for my entire life, absolutely tortured. And then so it kind of erupts into this idea as a younger person, which is kind of general, which is categories are bad. And now I kind of know, well, hey, categories actually kind of help us think any thought at all or identify anything at all. It's not like that, right? There's something about analogy that I also find completely fecund and generative. So to back up though, so I think it started out, and I'll try and be brief, with this idea of like trying to research something about why categories are not real or something, sort of in my early 30s, I guess, and my first thought was everything's the same. That all difference is an illusion, and actually everything's made out of the same thing, and all edges are an illusion, and so a lot of good thoughts kind of in there, sprinkled in. But then when I went to look up, find this fundamental particle, because I went to physics, which was really funny, because I didn't mean just like everything's made of the same thing, like there's commonality. I was like really like going to the particle. And no matter what I read, and this is kind of before the internet a little bit, so it's not like it was exhaustive or anything, but what I found was basically information about the ecstasy of heterogeneous systems and ecosystems and biodiversity. And I just wasn't finding in anything, philosophy or science, I wasn't finding anything about sameness myself. And so I started to make different thoughts, which had to do with the kind of ecstasy of heterogeneity and difference. And I started to realize like this urge to sameness as the solution to separation was maybe even kind of verging on more of a kind of fascist thought or a more scary thought. And anyway, so, long story short, from there, I've done a lot of different thinking about that and reading about that. And, I'm still confused though, about how separateness works. Because you asked me about separateness, you didn't ask me about difference. But in my mind, they're linked, and it feels like a mistake. They're not the same thing, and I'm not quite ever able to pull that apart, number one. And then number two, in both of those passages, the character of the author, who's sometimes me, is so invested in the idea that there's something between us, the world, the matrix of the world, the material of the energy of the world. And I don't believe in emptinesses. I only believe in fullnesses. That's somehow all of that stuff, just like sound on air, that all of the energy between us is going to travel like sound on air. The energy between us will reach each other, basically. And that by that field, we will be affected by one another, that it's not a spiritual idea, particularly, of being affected by one another, that it's very material. And, and also I think that there's a mistake in the thinking, and that comes up in the second part, which is that this idea that somehow that matrix or that intermediary substance, or not even because we're part of it, so just whatever the field that we're part of, is somehow going to connect us, even if it's unactivated by interest. That it connects us without us doing anything. And it was funny because yesterday when I went back into the Arendt quote, she's not saying, for example, that the table or the world between us, and one's an analogy for the other. There's another part to it, which is that for her anyway, there's this idea of interest that does the connecting. And so I think in both of those passages, I've left out the idea of activating the field with some kind of action on my part.
she's she's all classical, you know. I mean, it's great to read her because, but it's also frustrating sometimes because, well, for two things. One, there's certain stuff which there's a limit against which maybe you or I might butt our heads, not so much even in her thought, but in some of what it is that she's thinking about. And our impulse, maybe because we also have, maybe because we, see, I was just gonna say something. Well, okay, I'll say what I was gonna say and then I'll take it back. Okay.
Okay,
I was
perfect.
we maybe we feel the brutalization of category in a way that she didn't feel it. But that's not true. She got run out of her country and run out of her continent as a function of the brutality of category. So she had to feel it.
Yeah.
But there's this way in which maybe the rigorous commitment to a certain philosophical tradition that she made long ago
Mhm.
requires her to continue to work through a problem that we would just try to break it down. We just try to tear it down, you
Mhm.
know. For instance, category, you know. But I guess what I'm trying to say is when I think of what you were saying before, the other person that comes to my mind who's maybe more aligned with how you or I might approach it is Denise De Silva, um, who and it's funny. The thing that we were reading in the class that I was telling you about the other day was an essay by her called "On Difference Without Separability."
Yeah.
So what Denise tries to do is to really, make a kind of sharp distinction between difference and separability in a way that I think allows her to not maybe to avoid that same fascistic sort of expression or commitment to self, to not self, but to sameness that you were describing. But then there's this other part of it where if you if you believe in the necessity of a sharp distinction between difference and separability, is is the relation between difference and separability one that we would characterize as separability or one that we would characterize as difference? That's how come when you talk about understanding how separation works, it makes me, I feel like maybe I feel like that's a necessary sort of thing rather than simply, a kind of surrender. And this is just a long-winded way of saying maybe it's a way of talking about artworks, right? Like maybe it's a way of talking about some, maybe it's a way of thinking about the necessity, even if I don't want it to be necessary, of the separability of the artwork. So when you think of sending of sending your love into the world through the artwork, is does that manifest itself does that sending, is it because of the separateness of the individual artwork? Is it because of a more general sort of work that you do called art? You see what I'm saying? What's the status of the individual artwork and how does that work in relation to both separateness and connectedness?
Well, I think to back up a hair, the idea of a field of a heterogeneous field
Mhm,
in which things are webbed up and permeated by each other.
mhm,
It's hard to think it, at the beginning of it, but then after a while, it's not hard to think of a heterogeneous field where things are all undulating, against with, that affecting each other,
mhm.
right? So the idea of difference in a field where distinction, is not an issue or is impossible or something, or separability is not possible, and yet difference is possible, is thinkable.
Yeah,
I mean, for me, it's thinkable. And, it's just that once I've got it thought, what am I doing with it? And so I tend to go too quickly into these other propositions, the one about the artwork,
yeah,
um, which is that, and I think it's maybe, I don't know if it's a sculpture thing or if it's the aspiration of an artist. I think we all have different aspirations, but I think, for me, my brain kind of swarms. I have a kind of a swarm for a mind,
Yeah.
rather than a mind that seems to function in like, and so it's painful. And I think that when I'm making something and slow down enough to write a book, or I slow down enough to write a sentence, any sentence, it starts to slow it down.
Yeah.
And I love especially writing because it gets so slow that I get to go like, what did you just say? Did you mean that? Maybe that should go into two parts, and it starts to get very filigreed, I call it, and I hope the same thing happens with the sculpture. But I think my point is, I find myself kind of like more making, I feel more, less self-conscious and more in a flow of making
Yeah.
while I'm making stuff, right? And not when I'm talking to people necessarily, which is different than you, which I think is interesting. Or I get so scared before I talk to people that I get flustered or whatever. So anyway, in my practice, the practice of the practicing, is something that feels right, even if it feels hard.
Yeah.
And so I of course just want to leap over and say, I hope that me spending time this way helps, people feel loved on the other side of it, like that there's something, like it's a battery, it'll
Yeah.
suck up all this attention and love and intention and sweat and aspiration and all of that, and that'll somehow redistribute it. And if it doesn't, you could argue it never was supposed to, and that you're thinking about it wrong. Or you could argue a good artist, it would redistribute.
But it's it's just a freaky thing that however much we desire for our artwork to be a conduit through which that energy can flow, or through which that love can flow, um, it often gets to be clotted, you know? It turns, and this is the thing that's been freaking me out, I guess you could say, for the past year, that I love art, like so much, but I feel freaked out sometimes by this suspicion or this feeling I have that all the stuff that's supposed to go through it, that's all the stuff that's supposed to go, to flow through it, it gets clotted up, you know, um, and I don't know what to do, because the horrible part about it is that the only way I have of working through that is making art,
Yeah.
and then it's like, is something coming through? Is something coming through? So that's why I guess you put into words in such an elegant way the very thing that I guess I've been thinking about. It 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 it's a So I'm really waiting for you to tell me what to do, Harry.
Well, first of all, you're saying that are you saying that in your artwork? Because you're not a sculptor particular. I mean, you're a word sculptor, but are you saying in your artwork it doesn't satisfy you because it doesn't return a sociality back in your direction? Or are you saying when you look because I would find that hard to believe. I'm not going to fight with you about it, but it seems like people are getting stuff and you're able to get the work to function as a kind of, well, many things. Of course, it functions as many things, right? So I
Well,
hate to even say, but that there's a kind of flowing sociality associated with it. Whereas, or are you saying that there's some artworks that you're looking at that just feel clogged? They're not
well,
talking to
it's both. I don't like. I got another friend, Arthur Jaffa, who always talks about, and specifically with regard to Black art, that there's this feedback loop, between and that the art is in some ways both the mechanism which produces this feedback loop and the conduit through which it flows, but that feedback loop is from Black social life to the artist, and And, you know, part of what's at stake is you get to say Black social life a lot without being more specific about that. And I would say probably maybe most importantly without being sort of class specific about that, you know. And so what ends up happening is sometimes I feel like, and I'm not talking about anybody else's art but mine. Sometimes I feel like I see where it is that this came from, and I have a hard time seeing the difference between my my I don't know how not to call my relation to the sources of my art extraction. I don't see that I have you know, a sort of justification for not thinking about it that way. But then the other part of it is it's not just that you want sometimes that you want your art to show love or to express love, but sometimes you want it to express hate. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes you want it to tear shit up,
Yeah.
and I'm like, and so I'm equally concerned about when it fails to blow shit up, you
Yeah.
know, as well as when it fails to embrace. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about. You know? So,
Well, this all kind of brings me back to the idea of what we're asking our art, you know, to do basically on any given day. And I'm sure it's different from day to day, to these demands we're placing upon this weird experiment we're in, you know. Um, and that somehow what it does is what it does. And there's also a way
yeah,
that approach it on its own terms about what it does finally have to offer, you know, and not just the aspirational part or the intention. And I think those things are important, and those things are sitting in there. Maybe they're all nuggeted up somewhere inside or whatever.
yeah,
And they're emanating, but maybe it now has surprised us,
yeah,
you know, and I mean, you know, to me, I feel like it's much easier to accept that in other people's artwork. just to see it for what it is, and just to bathe myself in it, you know, when it moves me. And I am every so often moved, you know, by artwork and poetic expressions, you know, and human human endeavor.
yeah,
um, I'm also moved by, you know, other things too, kind of similarly, and sometimes more so. You know, we were just talking about Zion, or, you know, I like to visit the rocks, and there's different ways that it's taken me a long time to become even open to the the largesse and magnificence of human endeavor. I've been very misanthropic for most of my um, life, and so all of my excitement about human expression is sort of a newer feeling. And sometimes, you know, maybe I'm um, yeah, anyway, I think I'm going back a little bit to just this idea of what we want it to do, what it can do, what it will do, and that's going to change piece by piece. Um,
is is
and
it is it harder to find? I mean, you spoke about sort of matterphilia. Is
Yeah,
it harder to maintain that connection to the material? Do you think, um, vis-a-vis, you know, by way of human endeavor? Is
it's
that the problem?
yeah. I didn't. It took me decades to realize that humans were matter expressing itself.
Yeah,
And now that I've got that, you know, um, it's a whole new world for me. You know, I'm a lot more open, I'm a lot more curious, and I'm a lot more soft-hearted, um, and all of that.
yeah,
So yeah, it took me forever to get that. And it's funny because, you know, I grew up in the 70s. There was this kind of, you know, kind of budding idea of ecology, but there was also this budding idea of pollution.
yeah.
And I right away just, plus, like I said, being tortured by all this category stuff.
You know what? Uh,
These people are not nice.
The thing I'm thinking about, I've been thinking about it the whole time, but so when I think about Hannah Arendt's table, um, the other table that comes to my mind is I forget which one of the novels, but there's this trilogy of novels that Octavia Butler wrote. I guess altogether they're called Lilith's Brood. It's Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago. And it's just sort of amazing. The point I'm trying to get at before I ramble on too long is that there are these beings called the Oncali who travel in these sort of interstellar spaceships, which are also biological entities. And they have their own biological connection to the ship. And so there's these scenes which I don't know how well. There's a scene in which one of the Oncali goes into a room where a human being is being held in the interest of saving humanity or saving some element of humanity. This human being named Lilith is being held. And so in order to make the room more comfortable, they want to give her a table. And so they just touch the wall of the ship and a table rises up out of it. And the table is matter, and the table is biological matter, and it's also furniture or a furnishing too. And I guess when I remember going to see your show Works of Love in Los Angeles in that really little gallery upstairs, kind of down.
Yeah,
And I just thought, it reminded me, those sculptures in many ways reminded me of the image that I have of these fanciful shapes that must have been created as a function of touch, okay? As a function of a kind of, and it strikes me that interplay between the Oncali and Lilith that produced a table of living matter that was still also functional as a kind of furniture, that functions maybe a little bit like what you're describing in terms of the artwork as battery, but also in terms of, the materiality of connectivity, and the refusal of emptiness, the preference for fullness over emptiness.
Yeah, you mean that the table serves to symbolize for everybody involved that something's there and not nothing.
Yep. Yeah. Or, well, it could be that something's there and not nothing. Or it could be that nothing is there, which is to say, no separable thing is there. But what emerges is a panoply of shapes, or like I love the way in that first passage, there's two terms you use, variety and medley, and both of them are in italics, just to make sure that we know that you really meant that shit, right? That there was an emphasis that needed to be placed there on this notion of variety and medley. So what it would mean would be that the sense that there are no separable things would be the condition out of which a fullness of difference and differentiation emerges that we can experience.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the thing that I would add or notice or observe is, that I've, often been interested in, how do I want to say this? When we talk about fullness and theirness or materiality or whatever, often there needs to be a figure or a thing or, some way of referring to it. And then maybe I'm not even saying that's true. Maybe we could say field or air, or we could say matrix or luminiferous ether, or all the different things, about emptiness that would turn the idea of the emptiness into a fullness. But on the other hand, often there's an object or some other kind of thinginess, and I think that as a shorthand, I'm kind of interested in the idea that we're always being formed and unformed. And what's interesting is whether or not we draw ourselves as melty or proclaim ourselves to be melty, we are still always being formed and unformed, and whether or not we put an object in the room or to signify that there's to signify a matrix by which we might be connected, something that's going to convey things, you know, that my idea anyway is that it would be conveyed anyway.
No, but that's why I think that those pieces in works of love, those melty pieces, they feel like that rather than being involved in a more or less classical relation between shape and form, they're always on their way back to informality.
Yeah.
But it's just like extraordinarily highly wrought informality. Like it's an absolutely thoughtful, you know, careful, like painstaking informality.
Yeah, I think that those pieces, like you know, those sculptures in particular, those ones are very interested in getting something to be objecty or familiar or legible. We could talk about legibility, and then somehow it's defamiliarizing, or somehow making it be not that thing anymore, not the legible thing, but the new bucket or pole, or sort of whatever it is. I mean, that tension between what's legible and what's made, and I think that it's the same thing I'm talking about, the tension between producing, the tension where a figure, something that's legible, becomes now, I don't want to say illegible, but becomes less coherent.
Mm-hmm.
Is absolutely of interest, because I think I'm interested in, like, not necessarily needing to dissolve as a body, to acknowledge that my body's dissolving, you know, I guess.
You don't have to do it, you just have to admit it. You know?
Exactly. It's already happening.
Yeah, ain't nothing you can do about it one way or the other, you know. Actually, this intensity of consciousness regarding the constant dissolution of bodies, which then becomes kind of unavoidable to one as a kind of truth if you have to then confront the dissolution of your own body, that makes me think of the book that your book reminds me of, okay, maybe the most. And it's a book by John Donne called Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. And it's like maybe one of my 4 or 5 favorite books. So you're in right that 4 or 5 too. Okay. So it's like, and it's a book that Donne wrote as a kind of record of, but also meditation on his own bout with typhoid fever.
Oh, wow.
But it is also a function of his fascination with the dissolution of his body, his fascination with the dissolution of the body as fundamental to Christian doctrine and as the condition of possibility and therefore being saved. That the condition of possibility of grace is the dissolution of your body.
Right.
But he was also just deeply interested in science. He was really interested in medicine. And he was really interested in this argument that was going on. You know, this is the turn of the 17th century, about 2 modalities of doing medicine. One that was sort of more, you know, intuitive, but then at the same time based on formulations about, you know, authority with regard to notions about the bodily humors and all that kind of stuff that were really fanciful at the end of the day, as opposed to a new sort of evidence-based way of thinking about medicine, you know? So it's like this argument between Paracelsus and Galen, basically. And he's working that out the whole time, right? And it's that, I guess what I'm saying is the intimacy of your life and love and family relations is always totally entangled with this deep regard you have for science, this deep regard that you have for knowledge and for thinking and for so that one feels the thought as part of your intimate life. And it just makes me think maybe what is it makes me think about the connection between intimacy and intellectuality.
Yeah.
Jesus, that was meant to eventually morph its way into a question, but that's all I got right now. It's meant to,
You know,
like, yeah.
I have to respond by saying that, over the last decade or maybe 2 decades, maybe, whatever, somewhere in there, that's more and more I do experience, and I've said this before, I do experience like being confused and hard thinking as a full body sensual pleasure that does not make me uncomfortable in the sense of it being somehow work. It's literally like a very embodied thing that does feel intimate. It does feel there's a kind of eros to it, and it is, it is something I'm doing all the time. And I know you are too. I'm just happy to be able to.
No, it makes you think of, the end of Black Skin, White Mass, and Fanon says, "Oh, my body, make of me a man who questions." Like you think maybe it's almost perfect, but maybe if there were one word left out, like, "Oh, my dissolving body," "Oh, my dissolute body, oh, my impossible body, make of me someone who questions." But
Well, yeah, and there, well, I guess, but and maybe in the idea of a question, there's the kind of suggestion of an unforming
yeah, yeah.
in
So
that.
what kind of unforming are you up to now?
Are we
Have you
supposed to
moved
take
on to the next
questions?
unforming?
Yeah, I'm basically just unformed at the moment. I had to make a self to put one to arrive here somehow on the Zoom, as you know. But are we supposed to take questions from the
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, and am I supposed? Oh my God.
American?
No, I'm here. I didn't want to interrupt you. It was too exciting, but there are a bunch of questions. So from Gabriella Burnham says, do you think fascination with the dissolution of body requires a separateness or difference between self and body?
Well, no, not particularly. I mean, I think that everything. I mean, if you kind of get, just with the idea of things being generally forming, but if the minute you talk about something as being formed, it's also being unformed from the thing it was, a moment ago, which doesn't necessarily sort of touch on the idea. I don't think of there being a problem with separation. I think that I always think of it as like a million different points of forces meeting in every organism, and each person or organism or thing has its own location. That's why I wanted to ask Fred about non-locality. It has its own location in history and in the force field, which makes it very specific. And so that I don't think that the dissolution necessary. I mean, what do you think, Fred?
I mean, I guess mostly what I think is that I tend to disbelieve. It's like, I know what people mean when they say the body, or my body. Um, but I, but, but, have you ever had somebody teach you something, even though if you don't know for sure if they believe it, but they wrote something anyway? So, and you have to attribute it to them, but you can't, but you're scared to ask them if they actually meant what you think they meant.
Oh yeah.
But Hortense Spillers taught me to disbelieve in the body.
Who did?
Hortense Spillers.
Okay.
So I feel like I can talk about flesh, and I feel like flesh allows me to understand a little something about that relay or that relationship, so to speak, between fullness and nothingness, even, but when I think about the body, or even when I think about particles, I feel like I get caught in a paradox, that I don't want to be caught in. I want, my desire is for a kind of non-particulateness,
Yeah.
and so you know, and it's and because I don't know the math, all I'm left with is my desire,
Yeah,
right?
fair enough.
And I guess I'm sort of happy to not know the math, you know. I'm gonna think my way out of it the way I want to, you know. And if I'm wrong, probably it won't hurt anybody,
No, I'm sure it won't.
since there's no body to hurt. so, so,
Kathleen asks, are there ways that language enhances or limits your artistic thought process before production, either in word, sculpture, otherwise?
Yeah, I can briefly answer that, which is it absolutely enhances. I mean, the way my practice works is it's a lot of thinking and reading in language, a lot of thinking and reading in language, which I just said I completely find a lot of pleasure in. And then when I move into the studio, I think of it as like that I've sort of like I've educated my cells with all of this pleasure and thinking, and that I hope, my kind of wager in my experiment is that whatever is going to then kind of emerge as the sculptural poem or whatever you want to call it, is somehow related to those things, but it's the next better thought that my conscious brain or my language brain might not even be able to conjure. So that I'm hoping to, sort of add all this language up and sort of emerge into a poem or something that is better than the sum of those parts. So I would say enhanced a lot.
Carolina says, congrats, Harry, and hello, Fred. Fred, you said in an interview, a mess is a unit of measure. This makes me think about leaning in more poetically rather than logically into an understanding of physics and chaos. What do you think about, consider gut logics? And how do you cope with the illogical aspects of being with a capital B?
well, it's funny. So the two artists who I think about the most with regard to this notion of mess are Harry Dodge and Douglas Kearney. Douglas is an extraordinary poet, wrote a beautiful book called Mess and.
Mhm.
And so, and when I think of Harry, I think of the other thing that comes to my mind is like the whole time in Works of Love, the soundtrack that was going in my head was actually a quite terrible song by Vanity Six called "Such a Pretty Mess." Remember Vanity Six? They were like the first Prince spinoff band,
No.
and they had one big hit called "Nasty Girl." Vanity, right? And then her follow-up song was "A Pretty Mess," and it was a horrible mess. It was not pretty, but I finally saw a pretty mess. It's like, but when I say mess, I don't mean that to suggest an absence of precision or an absence of care or an absence of, you know, pains having been taken. I mean almost more like an abundance of pains having been taken. And what if that abundance of precision actually produces mess or more mess? But what if it's wrong to say that mess is a unit of measure? What if instead it's right to say that mess is like a practice of measure, where measure implies, among other things, dance, right? Like, I hate T.S. Eliot, but I still sort of fucking love him. And in Little Gidding, he talks about, that refining fire where we must move in measure like a dancer, right? And that refining fire, that level of precision, which I wouldn't say is an illogic, but maybe an analogic, so to speak. That, again, for me, that feels like always where Harry is working.
Next question, Mark asks, I would love to hear Harry talk about deciding to choose this medium of writing to share family stories so personally. what other media has Harry explored to tell the same story or capture it somehow?
Briefly, I made a lot of sculptures over a few years period, and my studio was getting more and more full, which happens to sculptors. It's a pain. It's a sculptor's pain. And so I was making smaller and smaller sculptures, which were funny. It was kind of like getting fractal in a way. I was putting them in between all the bigger ones and then the littler ones in between all of them. Pretty soon I just couldn't get in there anymore. And as all that was happening, I knew that I wanted to write something. And also, so to go back earlier in the conversation, there was something about an experiment with writing where I wondered whether or not I would be able to get a different kind of feedback that was actually more specifically oriented to the things that I was actually interested in, or that I would get some feedback at all, that there was some way of that. There was something about what language promised, whether it delivers or not, we don't know, but that it promised communication in a way that people are more used to, and that it would somehow allow people to speak back to me. And there was a kind of loneliness happening with the sculpture, because sometimes what I was getting back was kind of more embodied, or it was more poetic, or whatever, or maybe it was nothing. So there was a wager that the words might bring me into a more of a social place with my thoughts and practice. And so that was part of why I wanted to. And as far as I think it bears repeating that there's something about the character of the author that is me, but it's also not me. So if I'm a sculptor, but now I want to write, I got to write. And so there's something I got to find materials, And so when I'm finding materials, and I've been taught that, specificity, and that these kinds of things that are on offer, that they're sort of more gripping when they're specific. And so I'm borrowing things for the writing practice from my life. And yet it's not because I necessarily want you to know more about my life. It's really because I want to do this practice of writing, and I want to be in touch with people, maybe to have conversations about thoughts. And so there's some play with borrowing those specificities. And again, all of that framing makes that character a little bit me, but mostly not me. Because it's a piece of art. It's an expression of something that is constructed.
I think we have time for one more question. There's a good one from Anna, a question for Harry. How did you arrive to the narrative form of My Meteorite? Was there a procedure to determine the order of time flow in the quote unquote story, or did the book's narrative arc reveal itself more intuitively?
I find it fascinating that you're maybe one of the only people that has ever acknowledged that there's a narrative arc in My Meteorite. But I always thought there was, but briefly, because I know we have to end, I started taking notes at the beginning of 2016, when right around the time my dad started to get sick with dementia. And I thought, well, I'm going to write this book. And I was also interested in these coincidences that had started to happen with my birth mother, blah, blah, blah. So I started taking notes. And I said, I'm pretending to write a book, which took the pressure off. And so there was a certain point about a year later when my dad died, and it was the next day that I sat down and started to write out the book. So I went into the notes and thought, I gotta make this note make sense, and I gotta fill it out. And this is my work now. It's like, I'm not going fast anymore. I'm going slow. But at that point, I started to have a life after my dad died. So I feel like the book kind of goes forward in 2016, but also 2017 is going forward. So it kind of alternates in a forward progression, mainly between 2016 and 2017. Sometimes I think of it as sort of horseshoe shaped. And I did try to make the book a little more readable by having a little bit of forward progression. So I'm glad you could detect it and appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much, Fred and Harry, for a wonderful evening. At least there's this positivity before we go into whatever else the evening has in store.
Yeah, whatever else. Thank you so much, Fred. It was just such a pleasure to talk to you, and I just love you so much.
I love you too, always. Zoom hug.
Zoom hug.
Julian taught me how to do this until we can do until we can really make it matter,
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you everybody for showing up for this. It really means a lot to me. And thank you, Maris, again.
Buy books. That's
Bye.
it. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.